Hey guys, and welcome back to another Mystery Monday video on my channel. Today's video is going to be a little bit different than my usual videos because this case is dated back in the 1920s. So this is a very old case. Also, I just want to say before we get into this case that this case is located in Germany, so a lot of the words throughout this video are very difficult to pronounce. So I will either be putting the words on the screen or trying my very best to pronounce the words to the best of my ability. But I sat and practiced many of these words and I still couldn't master saying them, so bear with me with that throughout this video. Hinterkaifeck was a small farmstead located in Bavaria in between the two towns of insert first town here and second town here. And Hinterkaifeck was about 70 kilometers outside of Munich. In 1922, this farmstead was home to 6 people: Andreas Gruber and his wife Cecilia, their adult daughter Victoria Gabriel, and her daughter Cecilia, who was 7 years old and named after her grandmother, and Victoria's 2-year-old son Joseph, as well as the family's maid. The farm itself was very secluded and it had dense woods on the grounds behind it. The family lived in one main house on the property, but there were several other buildings surrounding the farm. In March of 1922, Andreas had allegedly confided in a neighbor, Lorenz, insert name here, that there were strange things going on at the farm. He had allegedly told this neighbor that he found footprints leading out of the woods and up to the main house where the family was living, but there was no footprints leading away from the home. And after talking to his whole family, it was clear that none of them had been out that night or walked up to the house after the snow had fallen. He had also told this neighbor about strange sounds that he had heard coming from the attic and things being moved around the home without explanation. Andreas had also said that a strange newspaper had arrived on the farm without any explanation of how it got there or where it came from. And on top of all of this, just 6 months earlier, their maid had quit, claiming that the grounds were haunted. So this led the family to believe that their home was possibly being stalked by a paranormal entity. On Thursday, March 30th, the Gruber household had gained another member, the new live-in maid Maria Badgoner, who was replacing the maid who quit 6 months earlier. But this job would play out horribly for Maria, because sometime on March 31st, 1922, the Gruber family, along with Maria Badgoner, were all brutally murdered. 4 days had passed before neighbors had came to the home and discovered the bodies, and because of these 4 days, it made it very difficult to narrow down when exactly the murders took place. The bodies were discovered in the family's farm, stacked on top of one another, hidden underneath some hay. And because of how long ago this case actually did take place, it took the police until April 5th, which was 5 days after the believed murder took place, to arrive and actually collect evidence from the murder scene. The main investigator on this case was George Gruber, and an on-site autopsy was done of all of the bodies, as well as their heads were shipped off to a specialist, but nothing of any significance came from any of this. All 6 of the victims had severe skull, head, and facial wounds, and Victoria, as well as her mother Cecilia, were the only 2 to show signs of strangulation. This led investigators to believe that there could have possibly been more than one killer, and after investigating the home, they came to find that burglary was not the motive, as nothing was missing and a large sum of money was found inside the family home. And like I mentioned before, Victoria and Cecilia were the only 2 to show signs of strangulation, suggesting that the killer's anger could have been directed towards these 2 women. Investigators also believed, because of the wounds on the body, that all of these killings were done very precisely and quick. The maid Maria and 2-year-old Joseph were both murdered in their beds, but the other victims were believed to have been led out to the barn before being murdered. Now, this next part is very graphic and disturbing, and it does involve the daughter Cecilia, who was only 7, so if that kind of stuff really disturbs you or you can't stomach it, I'm going to leave a timestamp in the description box so that you can skip this part of the video. 7-year-old Cecilia was not believed to have been dead when she was placed in the hay, suggesting that she laid bleeding out, pushed against her loved ones. Investigators also found that Cecilia had pulled out chunks of her own hair, and they believed that this was either due to pain or grief or both. Officer Gruber was so disturbed by this little fact that he spent the rest of his life trying to solve this case. Investigators also found that the crime scene had been compromised. In the household, many items had been moved around, and in the last 4 days after the murders had taken place, there was many visitors walking in and out of the Gruber's home, meaning that any solid evidence in this case was now completely destroyed. There was a significant lack of food in the Gruber household, seemingly odd since it was a farm. And even odder, all of the animals had been fed and the cows had been milked in the time after the murders had taken place. Neighbors also said that after the murders were believed to have happened, they saw smoke coming out of the chimney, suggesting that the killer or killers stayed in the Gruber's home after brutally murdering the family. Evidence also suggested that there was something like a small animal or a person living in the Gruber's attic, but they could not gather enough evidence to prove that this wasn't in fact one of the Grubers themselves. Now, this is where this case takes a little bit of a twist and becomes a little bit more disturbing. Investigators found evidence to suggest that Andreas and Victoria were involved in an incestual relationship with one another. The incest relationship was already known by locals who lived around Hinterkaifeck farm because Victoria and Andreas were both previously jailed for having a sexual relationship with one another. The whole Gruber family, but in particularly Andreas, were all really hated for this act. Not just for the incest relationship, but also for the shame that it had brought into the village. But being disliked really didn't bother Andreas, and he was allegedly very outspoken about his relationship with his daughter. Investigators began to believe that this could have been a playing factor in the murders. Originally, in this case, investigators had a very hard time identifying a murder weapon and were unable to do so, until just a year after the murders had taken place, when the Hinterkaifeck farm was being cleared out. A farmhand by the name of George Siegel found the murder weapon. The murder weapon was identified to be a homemade matlock. And for those of you who don't know what this is, because I did not know what it is like a long-handled pickaxe. And this one was homemade and believed to have belonged to Andreas himself. Siegel told police that this matlock was usually kept with Andreas's other tools locked away in a shed. The matlock was used to make very precise cuts on all of the victims, and it is believed that it would have taken a lot of practice to get the cuts so precise with a tool like this. Investigators had also discovered at this time who the people were who came to the farm after the murders. One of the visitors was a postman who had visited the farm on April 1st and 3rd. And the second visitor was a mechanic who came to visit the farm on April 4th to fix the Gruber's feeding machine. And that is really all the information on the people who visited the farm after the murder took place. But this just leaves me with a lot of questions. Like, did these two people see anybody? Or who called the mechanic? Was it the Grubers or somebody else? Information about the Gruber family, along with their maid, was gathered by investigators from people who knew the family, and this was to build a profile of the killer, but unfortunately the profile has not been released to the public, or at least I couldn't find it anywhere. And this brings me to the first suspect in this case, who was Lorenz, who I talked about earlier in this video, who was the Gruber's neighbor. This was the man that Andreas had allegedly told about all of the strange happenings on the farm. And it is very possible that Andreas did tell Lorenz about all of these strange things that were going on, but the two men did have bad blood in the past. Lorenz had actually wanted to marry Victoria and had asked Andreas for his daughter's hand in marriage, but Andreas had shut him down immediately. Victoria and Lorenz had actually been involved in a sexual relationship, and Lorenz believed that Joseph was his son. That is, until he found out about Andreas and Victoria's incestual relationship. But despite this, Lorenz was still asked to pay child support even though he was denied access to the child. Obviously, all of this information would be enough to anger anybody, and Lorenz allegedly would have known the farm very well because he was quite involved with the family up until the point when him and Andreas had began to fight. Lorenz was also believed to have been part of the group that had discovered the bodies, and he was apparently the first person on the scene when the police had arrived. Some places online also say that the Grubers had a dog, and after the murders had taken place, the dog showed extreme aggression towards Lorenz, but this is not a confirmed fact. And that brings me to suspect number 2, which was Victoria's husband, Carl Gabriel. It was believed that Carl was struck by a mine and passed away in 1914, but his body was never found and there was no proof of this. Now, I'm not really sure how they would have done a DNA test in the 1920s, but it was said online in a few places that a DNA test was done and it had come back that Joseph was in fact Andreas's son. And people speculated because this word spread so quickly that Carl could have been alive somewhere else living out his life, and this news could have reached him, and this would have been motive enough for him to want to murder the family. In 1921, a man by the name of Joseph Barrett had escaped a mental hospital, and he was believed to have been in the area around Hinterkaifeck farm around the time of the murders. It was said that brutal killings, such as these 6 murders, were something that this man was capable of, so people have speculated that theory. People online have also tried to link Frederick Harmon to these murders. He was a serial killer in the 1920s who mainly targeted male prostitutes, and he was called the vampire killer because he drained these people of their blood and then drank it. But besides the fact that he was a serial killer who was around at the time of these murders, there really is no other evidence to suggest that he was responsible for this case. Many locals who lived around Hinterkaifeck farm at that time speculated that something paranormal had happened to the family, and rumors were going around that the devil himself had visited the farm that night. This case is one that leaves me with more questions than answers. Like, did Cecilia know that Andreas and Victoria were involved in an incestual relationship, and was she just fine with it? When I first started reading about this case, I thought that maybe Cecilia had caught Andreas and Victoria in the act, and that is how the killings had actually happened. But that doesn't explain how she ended up dead in the same manner. Unfortunately though, this case is one that will likely never be solved. Not only because of how old it is, but in 2007, investigators decided to take another look at this case, and they discovered that key evidence in this case was either now missing or hadn't been collected at all. So the chances of us ever finding out what happened at Hinterkaifeck farm on that day is slim to none. There were many people questioned in this case and many key suspects, but none with enough evidence to actually charge anyone. So this case is completely cold. And guys, that brings us to the end of this video. If you like this video, please give it a big thumbs up, and don't forget to comment down below what you'd like to see in my future videos, and don't forget to subscribe. Also, turn on that notification bell so that you don't miss any of my future videos. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys!